um, on Dataverse TV, and we'll update the different channels, Slack and Zulip and Google, uh, the Dataverse community meeting, community forum on Google Groups, um, with links to those to the slides and uh, the recording. There's some links in this that I'll be talking about in this recording, in these slides, and I don't know if I'll be able to add the links in chat, but the links will be accessible through the slides as well. And you'll see them. Someone asked a question. This is the second session. The first session is, I don't think it's recorded, because I was just looking at the slides for them. Yeah, it's not recorded, but the slides are available and I'll be talking about the first session during these slides as well. Answer live. All right. So I'll be covering, but this is part of the introduction that I'll be covering. We'll be talking a bit about metadata blocks. I am assuming that you have some kind of familiarity with Dataverse, or you might be in the process of learning. Um, uh, I won't go into too much of the metadata blocks from the perspective of researchers and support staff like curators. Um, but the first session in this series about metadata and Dataverse repositories goes over that. Um, then we'll be spending the most of the time talking about uh, different ways to configure metadata blocks and the dataset fields within those metadata blocks. Um, and we'll end with some guidelines and questions, surveys, and a list of upcoming webinars this month and next month. What I won't be covering, so as I was preparing this, there's so much, and I did, I couldn't cover it in an hour. Um, but I thought I'd mention it here. Um, we'll be talking mostly about metadata about data sets, so at the data set level, which would be a collection of files that describe a study, as opposed to metadata about collections, or dataverse collections or sub-dataverses, for folks who are more familiar with Dataverse. We won't be talking about that. We won't be talking about metadata about files. We won't be talking about system-generated metadata, so like uh, persistent IDs that are assigned to datasets and files when you create datasets, or some kinds of dates. File level metadata is often system generated, like the types of files, the size, metrics, stuff like that. We won't be talking about. Um, I won't be talking about internationalization or displaying metadata fields in different languages. Um, I will be, I will mention it briefly, I think, um, uh, but I won't be going into much detail about that. I won't be going into technical implementation detail. So there are steps that you have to take after you've designed the metadata block, after you've configured it. Uh, some of those involve like running API calls, adjusting system configurations and database settings. I won't be talking about that, but there will be links to parts of the Dataverse guides, um, where we go into more detail about that. And lastly, I won't be talking about possible and upcoming improvements. So we're focusing on what's possible now as of Dataverse 6.6, the last update that was released a few weeks ago. But we won't be talking about possible improvements. Oops, wrong way. That said, at the end, I'll have a link to, all the different ways to contact the community to get involved in different groups that are working on ways to, evaluate Dataverse and to improve it, to offer your perspectives and help work on uh, changing the Dataverse, hopefully to improve it. Keep going the wrong way. So please feel free to introduce yourself in chat. I will say that I'll be focused on um, the slides and my notes, so I might not catch everything. Please post questions in the question and answer, like Bob Rice, your question about the second session. Thank you. Keep doing that. I will say I won't, because I'd like to cover everything, and there's a lot, even though I did try to limit how much I'm talking about today. Um, I w- I won't be able to take questions until the end. So hopefully there'll be 10 to 15 minutes at the end um, of this presentation webinar that which ends at 10:30. There's a contributor covenant code of conduct. Please review it when you can. But I summarize some parts here. When you're chatting or um, at the end of the questions, please use welcoming and inclusive language and respect different viewpoints and um, all those other points. All right. So I've been working on Dataverse for about 9 years. I do user experience research. Different kinds of design research, like interviews and usability testing. Working a lot on metadata design, um, and also working on, with the curation and support team at Harvard Dataverse, one of the one of the repositories that uses the Dataverse software. By the end of the webinar, you should be able to use Dataverse's metadata features to make data more fair. And I should be able to help improve our webinars like this one based on your feedback. At the end of the webinar, there'll be like a short survey. It is really, really short. Please consider filling it out. There'll be a link just to let us know your perspective. I've used that to help inform the design of this webinar and the first session's webinar. Okay, so briefly about metadata blocks. They are collections of metadata fields that depositors see when creating and editing their deposits in Dataverse repositories. In the user interface, they're in these collapsible accordions. So here we see like citation metadata and a collection of metadata fields with different components in the user interface for users to fill in those fields. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about metadata blocks. You see that a lot if you haven't already in the language, across Dataverse, in the user interface, in the guides, in webinars. We have these geospatial metadata block and social science and humanities. They're organized in all sorts of ways, but they tend to be influenced by the type of research that's being done, or aspects of the data, or qualities of it, like geospatial. Um, they also can be influenced by metadata standards, which themselves are influenced by the type of research being done or the community doing that research. I talk a lot more about metadata blocks from the perspective of researchers depositing and support staff, in that first webinar that we mentioned. There's a link here. So when you get the slides, you'll be taken to when you get these slides, you can use this link to go to the slides from the first webinar in November 2023. oops, wrong way. So the next part of the webinar will be talking about these 12 points. I tried to organize them this way and sort them in a way where um, the concepts that are introduced kind of build on each other. Um, and also talking about, so what can we configure and how can we configure it? I tried to break those two things apart. But there are lots of, there are different ways of controlling, of creating metadata fields, creating metadata blocks, uh, controlling how the blocks behave, how users can use them. And we'll be going through each of these, as we go through how we can configure different, properties of the metadata blocks and metadata fields within those blocks. So first, you create a metadata block, and the main way to do that is with the metadata block TSV file, which is a tabular file. It's separated by tabs. It lists all the fields in a metadata block and a lot of information about each metadata field at the dataset level again. So I'll start by giving an overview of it, and later we'll see how we can use it and other methods to let us configure the fields. So the metadata block, so it's divided into 3 sections. I should have mentioned that. I'm like trying to manage 2 screens here. So there are 3 sections in the metadata block. The first one is at the top, and it's the metadata block section where we name the metadata block. We give a name that the database is aware of, and it's kind of a machine readable name so that, it's all lowercase, no spaces. And then the display name is what users see in that accordion that we just saw. The Dataverse alias is where you would put the name of a collection within your installation if you want that metadata block to be available only for that collection. And we'll go over that a bit more later on. And then the last block, the last part of that section, the last column E, block URI, we'll go into that in a bit as well, because that's connected to some other things. The dataset field section is the second section here, and it's usually the biggest. It's where each row is a metadata field. And this is where you'll be naming the fields and controlling other properties of the fields, like the tooltips, the type of field that will be used, that to make it easy for people to fill in information, the order and the structure of the fields, and a lot more. And then the last section is this controlled vocabulary section, where and it's used to list terms that depositors must choose for the fields that are defined in that second section, in that dataset field section. So here we can see, for example, and we'll go over this as we talk about different ways of adding controlled vocabularies to fields to improve metadata. But we can see here, some of the subject terms that depositors and curators can choose when they're using that a subject field in the citation metadata block. So like I mentioned in that second section, is each row will be a dataset field. We can control title, and the name. So the name, this name column is the database name. This title column here is the name of the field that's displayed in the Dataverse user interface as users see them, people depositing and looking for data. I'm going to jump around a bit to go back to this how this is connected to the first section, the metadata block section, and this metadata block ID column is where we would put the name of the metadata block, basically, um, which is the name that's in column B of the metadata block section. I think we have this flexibility because technically you can define fields for different metadata blocks using the same TSV file, but in the guides we mentioned it's best practice not to do that, and it's better to and I think most people are doing that, creating a TSV file for each metadata block. So this would usually be just the same metadata block ID, which is at the top here. So the block URI is the other thing that I wanted to talk about that I skipped from that first section. And this is related to mapping dataset fields. I won't go into mapping too much, but because that could be its own webinar or its own series. But basically, we want to make sure that the metadata that we publish is saved in different formats or different metadata standards, so that it can be discovered in different systems and preserved. There are 3 ways to map the fields that we create to fields in other metadata standards or schemas. The first 2 ways are to use this metadata block TSV file, which lets us control how fields are mapped in each deposits in 2 different places, in a metadata export called OAI ORE and in archival bags. So basically, in this block URI, you would give kind of like a base URL for the entire block, and then by default, all the fields would get that term URI. So here, if there was nothing in the title row here, row 4, if there was nothing in the term URI field, this would be what Dataverse would give for the term URI. Dataverse.org/schema/citation/title, the name of the database name of the field, right? But because there is something in the term URI field, we've kind of overridden that, so that instead of using what's in the block URI field, it's using another URI from Dublin Core to kind of say, this title is the same. This title field is the same as the title property for the Dublin Core metadata standard. And you can do that for each field. The third way to do this is with creating metadata export formats. And again, like I won't go into it too much, but the guides go into a lot of detail about how to do that. Creating these metadata export jar files. So this is available for Dataverse repositories that are using version 5.14 or later, and they let us create new metadata exports to replace the exporters that ship with Dataverse. And by exporters, I mean like Dublin Core and DDI Codebook, these files that are created when you create datasets and that become available for other systems to index, so that those systems can make the datasets that that we publish available. That's kind of outside of this, mostly outside of the scope of this, but I wanted to mention that since the metadata block TSV file does let you control some of that aspect as well. This is again, like I've already mentioned, the title is where you would put you would name kind of the display, how the field is displayed to users, right? The user-friendly display. We can control it. We can control it in the metadata block TSV file. We can also control it in a properties file. So each metadata block has a properties file, and what's written in the properties file is overrides what is in the TSV file. But it's a good idea to keep these two things in sync. But anyway, here I highlight the line in the properties file for the citation metadata block that defines the title or the name of the field that users see in the user interface. It's very similar for editing tooltip text. So here we can see a screenshot of what I mean by tooltip text. When you hover or click on that question mark icon next to the name of the field, we get more information about the field. You can enter that information in the description column. You can also enter it, I keep going the wrong way. You can also enter it in the properties file. So a lot of the text, a lot of the text-based changes that you can make to metadata can be made in both places. The same thing with watermarks, right? So here we have HTTPS as a watermark, which means that users see it, and when to give them a sense of like what they can or should or are allowed to put in that field. When they click in that field, the watermark disappears, and when they start typing, and hopefully in this case it's a URL because it needs to be. And then again, you can define that in the properties file as well. Okay, so those are kind of like really easy changes to make. The next changes to make are we have to introduce some more concepts for Dataverse. And I have this little building blocks thing. So the first concept is, of course, that installations are made up of collections, and each collection can have its own configuration, and that includes how we configure metadata blocks and fields. We already saw this kind of when I mentioned that we can tell Dataverse to allow only a certain collection within our installation to use a metadata block, but there's a lot more that you can do. And then the second concept is how it relates to the deposit workflow and the fact that it's split up into two different pages when you're creating a data set versus editing a data set. So we have a page for what we usually call the data set create page, and where they'll see a subset of all the metadata fields in the metadata blocks. And then we have the dataset edit page where they will, well, my highlighting is messed up here, but they'll see all of the metadata fields. So I meant to highlight the new fields, but you can see, in the first screenshot, we have title, author, point of contact. In the second screenshot, we have other fields between title and author because those were hidden on the dataset create page. And they appear on the dataset edit page. So that concept of what appears when in either of these two pages is important going forward because it's connected to a lot of other ways that we can configure metadata fields. So that also means that users must fill in required metadata to create a data set, right? That's like a rule in Dataverse. Because of that, required fields always appear on the dataset page. So making fields required is connected to making fields appear, is connected to where fields appear. So that's important to understand as you're configuring the metadata fields and figuring out when the field should appear, if they should appear. Yeah. So we have display order, and I just mentioned this here quickly because this is one of the things that we cannot change at the collection level, right? This is something that is set for all collections that can use the metadata block. And that's where the field appears, in what order the field appears on the page when it's displayed, right? So here we have, for example, title is given 0, so it always appears on top. There are other fields that don't appear on this dataset create page, so they're not here. But when they do appear, like we saw a couple of slides ago, they'll kind of wedge themselves between title and author because subtitle is given the order number 1, alternative title is given the order number 2, and so on. But one of the things that you can control at the collection level is whether or not a field is required. So I'll spend a couple of slides talking about that next. And this is also connected to controlling where fields appear because, like I said, of how making fields optional or required determines if they appear on the dataset create page or the dataset edit page. So by default, all metadata fields are optional if depositors and curators can see them, right? But in the metadata block TSV file, we can make them required. And again, that forces them to be on the dataset create page because they need to fill it out before they can save the dataset. So here we have the title that's required, so that always appears, and it gets this red asterisk mark in the user interface. And if users, of course, if they don't fill this in and they press save, they'll get a warning, an error message saying you have to fill in, you have fields that are missing. Please fill these in. So these two columns are connected. Display on create, you can that's what that's supposed to say. The display on create column is connected, and it should be true whenever required is true. But the opposite isn't always true. So that's why they're two separate columns, and we'll see that in a second. So here required is false for the alternative URL. This is confusing. So it's not here. It's not on the dataset create page. I see what I'm trying to say. And it's not required, so it's also not on the dataset create page, but it is on the dataset edit page. So you can, when display on create is false, it doesn't appear on that field does not appear on the dataset create page, like the alternative URL field, but it does appear on the dataset edit page, and this should be pointing to alternative URL. Something happened with my formatting. But here we can see a case where display on create is true. So the field is on the create page, but required is false. So people can create data sets and they don't need to fill in the affiliation field. The other way to control this is at the collection level, and the user interface lets us do this. So for fields that are made required through those settings in the metadata block TSV file, the field must appear on the dataset create page, right? But for fields, can everyone hear me now? I'm so sorry. What the heck?
I can hear you now.
Uh, okay. All right. A lot of the comments were about how no one can hear me. And now you can all hear me. I don't know we where you could not start hearing me. I'm not sure what part in the slides. Do you recall, Dwayne?
I'll
This was
be
at
honest.
10:0 this was at 10:02.
Yeah, that sounds about right, to be honest with you.
Yeah, yeah. I just don't know what part of the slides I was in at 10:02. Um,
Go to the previous slide. The one before this. I,
that's the
I would
one.
just I would just try to pick up from here.
Okay. To answer someone's question real fast, you can't click on the links. I put them there like this link with the arrow. Um, so that when you get the slides, it's obvious what to click on uh to follow a link, in this case to the guides that show how to use this API endpoint. Um, so the recording probably has me not saying anything for 5 minutes. All right, Andre, thank you. You were saying 2 or 3 slides more or less. Okay. Um, all right, so I'll start making fields optional or required. Um, you can do that through, well, I guess give me a thumbs up if you heard when I talked about um the dataset create and edit pages. Okay, perfect. All right. That's an important concept. All right. So I talked about display order, right? Hopefully that's obvious. That's where you control um where the fields appear, what order the fields appear in the metadata block. These two columns here, display on create and required, control also control that control where the fields appear when people create create datasets, sorry, versus when they edit datasets. So we have those two concepts, right? Um, and so if the field is required, it needs to be on the dataset create page. If it's optional, then it can be on the dataset create page, but it doesn't need to be. It can be on the uh, dataset edit page where people will go back to edit a dataset that they've already created. And then of course, like this example is showing, you can have the display on create be true so that the field appears on the dataset create page, but it's not required. So there's no asterisks, and people can save the dataset without uh, filling in that field. Um, as long as the metadata field is not required in the TSV file, you haven't set that at an installation-wide setting in the metadata block TSV file. Collection managers within your installation can control whether the field appears at all and whether or not it's required. And they can do that in the general information page settings in the Dataverse UI. And I have a screenshot showing the title field cannot be controlled by collection managers, um, but the subtitle field can be. They can click on the checkbox to hide it, they can make it required, which will force it to appear on the dataset create page. And then the UI, I mean, the Dataverse APIs also let you control these settings, right? And this is a relatively new feature. Um, Part of it is just making sure that you can do things through the APIs that you can also do through the UIs. Part of it is also giving collection managers the ability to add fields to the display on create page without making them required and without adjusting the metadata block TSV file. So there'll be, I think folks are working on being able to do that through the user interface, but right now it's available through the API. And then finally, the API also lets you submit incomplete data sets. If you know that you have to turn that setting on in your installation first, and then folks can use this endpoint, the submit incomplete dataset endpoint or do not validate endpoint. And it was mostly created to support integrations with platforms like GitLab, where that information doesn't exist, right? And you want to like pull information from another platform into your Dataverse repository. And then from there, you can fill in the incomplete metadata fields. Advanced search lets you control if the field appears in the advanced search link in the user interface. So here we have true for the title, and so then in the search page in the Dataverse repository, when they click advanced search, they'll see the title field. And so this is another example of a setting that cannot be controlled for individual collections, right? The advanced search will always work this way. The title field will always appear in the advanced search, regardless of what collection the user is on. But the facets work differently. Each collection manager can control which metadata fields are used as facets, as long as in the metadata block TSV file you mark facetable as true. So here we have the author name, and facetable is true for that column, for that row, right? And so then collection administrators can use the user interface settings, the same general information page, to say, okay, I want the author name to appear as a facet when people are searching through my collection. And so that's what this screen is showing, that the author name has been selected as one of the facets that appear on the left-hand side of the page if you're on desktop. So we can also associate fields with each other by using the metadata block TSV file. And this is the only place you can do that. So each row is a metadata field. Each metadata field has you can control what the parent of that field is, right? If it's blank, that could mean that that field is a simple field or a primitive field. It's just one thing, one piece of information that you need to enter, right? Like the title field is a good example of that. The author field is a compound field or a collection of child fields. And we can create those by defining the parent field and not putting anything in that parent column, but then creating additional child fields and making that and adding the database name of the parent field in the parent column. So here we have author name, author affiliation, identifier type, and author identifier. We have 4 child fields. And you can see them here as kind of a compound field. So it's one field that's made up of four child fields. And the order also lets us know um, the display order lets us know how to just, in what order to put these fields from left to right in like a Z fashion, right? Um, Left to right and then down, left to right. Um, we can let users enter multiple values using the metadata block TSV file. So here we have title, allow multiples is false, so you can't add multiple values, but alternative title you can. So we have true here, and in the user interface, a plus button is added, and when they click it, there'll be another field where they can add another alternative title. Alternative URL, oh, this is confusing. Alternative URL is true. Alternative title I don't think is, but I don't know why I did that. Um, but you get the idea. So the same thing with the author field. Um, at the parent level, so the row 7, right? Um, we would put true for allow multiples, and that means that when users click on the plus button, a new set of child fields appears, so they can add another set of child metadata for the author, right? So another name, another affiliation, another identifier type, and another identifier. Um, I wanted to also point out, I think I wanted to point out here, sorry, that allow multiples technically can be true for child fields, but the Dataverse UI has no way of of making that work. So we could think of these as nested fields as well, right? Where the name, affiliation, identifier type, and identifier are nested into the author field. Um, when that happens, uh, the child fields the child fields can't have different parents, and the child fields can't have their own children because of limitations in the Dataverse UI for displaying uh, uh, more kind of complex metadata structures. So that's why allow multiples is false. Um, uh, Next, we'll be talking about validating the metadata that users enter. Um, uh, part of that concept of metadata validation is tied into field types. Um, so here we have a field type row in the metadata block TSV file, and you can make the field a text field type, and that'll just give you a simple one line text box. You can make it a URL or an email as well, and that'll give you simple text boxes that might be smaller. But there's also validation tied in when you define that field type that way. So the URL, if you define the field type as a URL, then it expects a URL, and that's why we add the watermark. The same thing with emails, the same thing with dates. And then the last one here is the text box, which is a larger text box, right? When you want people to enter multiple lines of text, that allows HTML tags so that people can format the text, add paragraph breaks and bold text and links and so forth. Controlled vocabularies are also a way of validating metadata that users enter. A lot of work is being done on this. I'll go over some of it now. we can use the metadata block TSV file to add terms that users must pick when they interact with the metadata field. Here we have like the identifier type field. In that dataset field, the second section of the metadata block, right? In the author identifier row, we have true for allow control vocabularies. So that in the third section, in that control vocabulary section, we could define what the values for that control vocabulary will be for the terms that users see. So doing that, making this an allowed control vocabulary, and then defining control vocabularies here also changes the type of field. So it's another kind of field type, even though it's been split up into its own column in its own section, right? So it's a drop-down menu. When the terms are 9 or fewer, it's a simple drop-down menu. When the terms are 10 or more, the drop-down menu includes a search bar so that users can start typing in things to find the terms that they need. And if allow multiples is true, the drop-down menu also includes checkboxes so that they can select multiple terms from the controlled vocabulary. So that's the case with the subject metadata field. The second way to configure controlled vocabularies in Dataverse installations is using the Dataverse external vocabulary management. So through the metadata block TSV file, you can think of those fields as internal. This mechanism lets you choose terms from vocabularies that aren't managed by Dataverse, that are managed in other systems. That link, which again will be available in the slides, is points to the GitHub repository for the Global Dataverse Community Consortium, where that mechanism and other mechanisms are managed. And I'll talk a little bit about that now. On demodataverse.org, we can see that this mechanism has been used to change the design of the author metadata fields, so that when you start typing in a name, it's looking up names in the ORCID database. And so the drop-down menu is showing you the names and the ORCIDs of people who have publicly available profiles in this case, in the case of Demo Dataverse. And when you select one, that Dataverse records the ORCID ID of that name and the name itself, of course. Something similar is happening with the affiliation field, right? But we're looking up names of organizations. We're using the ROAR database and the ROAR APIs to find those names as you start typing, and suggest those names as you start typing, and record the IDs, the ROAR IDs of those organizations that the authors are affiliated with. All right, so guidelines, I just want to mention really briefly. There's a metadata text guidelines document, and it is mostly about the text-based changes that you make, that you can make in largely the metadata block TSV file and that properties file that I was talking about. And they take into account the different things that Dataverse does with that text, including how it combines the names of parent and child fields, and how tooltips and watermarks are designed. A content strategist a few years ago helped us create this document, and we've applied it to some metadata blocks, mostly the citation metadata block. And it's a living document, right? So these guidelines come from UX research that helps us understand our users and test that understanding by learning about how they use Dataverse and how they are affected by the changes that we make. Um, why did it end? 1 second. Um, okay, perfect. Um, I'm not going to go over the other. I wanted to point out some other guidelines that aren't in the metadata text guidelines, but I'm not going to, because I want to save at least 5 minutes for questions. Um, uh, but I wanted to stress how important it is to think about the metadata blocks that you're designing as things that need to be maintained, and to think about, how you can learn how people are using those metadata fields, especially if you have a greater number of users, um, yeah. So this is a link to a presentation I gave also in 2023 about using the metadata itself to help us get some clues about what's working or what's not working. But we can do usability testing and interviews and card sorting and all kinds of ways to help improve metadata and the standards, right, that we use. Um, so the link to the survey is there. I will try to copy it and paste it in the chat. But it'll also be in the slides. And let's move to questions. Thank you, Dwayne, um, for letting me know that it's 10:25. Lots of questions. Oh, and then here are the upcoming webinars. So curation training next week, a webinar about Dataverse and journals in May, and in September, another webinar about curation training with the Harvard Dataverse repository. Um,
Sorry to interrupt you, but
yeah.
the 18th curation training will be postponed.
Oh, okay. Okay. But yeah, but we'll be posting announcements for other webinars coming up. And I think this link also takes you to uh, a list of where that training is happening, or information on how to RSVP and what the training is about. So let's get to the questions. Should the block URI resolve to something when we create our own blocks? That's a good question. The block in that, because that block in the citation metadata block does not resolve to anything. It should resolve to something, but I think that's a question that has been asked, and other folks in the Dataverse community have have given answers to it. So I won't go into that too much. But it depends, right? Because well, I'm not going to go into that. But yeah, feel free to ask that question in the Dataverse community forum or in Zulip, and I'm sure that other folks in the community will answer and point to places where that's been discussed, because I know it has been, that question. So that was answered live. The question about clicking on the links was answered live in the slides. We have another question about metadata fields. What metadata fields make up the citation that shows up below the dataset title? I'm asking because if the author is not a person but an organization. Yeah, so the in the title, the author name field shows up in the dataset citation, the suggested citation, um, at the top of the dataset page, right? And the author name can be an organization, so you can add Census Bureau to the author name. I guess I'll say on demo Dataverse, we have that external controlled vocabulary functionality working right on the author name field, and it's only giving you personal names because that's the database that it's connected to. But the external controlled vocabulary also lets you enter in your own terms when the terms that are being suggested by the field don't fit. And so this would be one of those cases where if you want to enter an organizational name, you can't choose anything. You can't choose the names that are being suggested. So you can continue to type in your own name, the organizational name. But yeah, and then that'll appear in the suggested dataset citation. I hope that answers that question. Um, is there a workaround for allowing multiple child fields? Creating your own. So, I mean, so the workaround for the Dataverse UI would be making adjustments to the Dataverse UI or creating your own Dataverse UI, which is something that that last part, creating your own UI, is something that is becoming more and more doable as the APIs get worked on, and the Dataverse SPA, which is like a big re-architecturing of the Dataverse platform, will is kind of driving the need for more things to be possible through the APIs, so that you can create your own UI. And I think so that the Dataverse community can iterate more quickly to allow for more things like allowing multiple child fields like affiliation, which is a popular example. For fields with the ability to have multiple entries, is there a way to order the entries? I'm thinking about the use case where we need certain order to author. Not right now, no. So the Dataverse UI, the only way to you can order it, right, by entering the first name first and then clicking the next button, the plus button, to enter the second name second. After that's done, you can't to reorder it, you'd have to delete all the entries and then re-enter them in the correct order. And that's another UI thing, right? Where like we need a way to like define the order after you've entered the metadata. But that's not possible in the current Dataverse UI. Are there plans on including the ORCID and Aurora integrations in the main code? Not for the current, the current way that Dataverse works is sometimes called like the JSF version. So I can say confidently that uh, um, I think I skipped a question, but I can say confidently that like including ORCID and Aurora integrations in the main code won't, in the code that ships with Dataverse won't be isn't work that we'll be doing for the JSF version of Dataverse. Whether or not that will be done for the SPA version of Dataverse is still being considered. Um, and how that external controlled vocabulary functionality will work with the SPA version of Dataverse is also something that's still being considered. Um, but yeah, like some of these questions, I invite you guys to ask in the different channels, right? Like Dataverse community forum and Zulip, in different GitHub issues, if there are GitHub issues that where we're talking about these kinds of things already. The Dataverse community meeting is coming up in June at North Carolina at UNC, and that would be another good place to talk about it. I skipped this first question. Can the dataset field attribute still be modified after the metadata block has been used in production? And if yes, which ones can be changed without causing issues? That's a very good question. I say that the text-based changes, like the display name of the metadata field and the description, what appears in the tooltips, the watermarks, those can be changed without issue, right? You just have to like run whatever command that you need to reload the metadata block, I think, at least in my experience. But things like database names, the field structure, um, maybe the block URI and the term URIs that you define in the metadata blocks, the controlled vocabularies that are defined in the metadata blocks, those things are will cause more issues, I guess. Additional work would need to be done, right? Including maybe making changes to the database in order to adjust that. That's a good question. Thank you, Dwayne, for linking to the Dataverse community meeting. Oh, and including the link for the survey. Awesome, awesome, awesome. Can one also link the fields to ontologies? Yes, yeah. So by vocabularies, I meant all kinds of lists of terms and how they're related, or if they don't have a relation. But that would include taxonomies and ontologies. And so the one nice thing about the external controlled vocabulary functionality is that Dataverse will record the URIs to the terms, as well as recording the the names of the concepts. What was the question? We cannot see the questions until after answered. I'm sorry, Sherry. I don't know. Sherry, would you like to unmute? Are you still here? Sherry's not here, but I think that's okay. Um, all right, this will be the last question because we're like 8 minutes over. I'm really sorry. But there's a quick question regarding the metadata customization. How flexible is it? I mean, is it completely flexible, or there are attributes that are required to be present? Perhaps like PIDs. I'm not too sure what you mean, but this was a question asked by Osama Zubai. I'm really sorry if I mispronounced your name, but if you could, are you able to unmute yourself, or do we have to unmute him?
I gave him the ability to talk.
Oh, yeah, so please, yeah, if you,
Yes.
yes,
Thank you
hi.
so much. Yes, hi. Thank you for the presentation, first of all. And I'm just wondering, when we create the metadata blocks, how flexible with the attributes can it be? That's why I'm wondering about this. Is it like completely flexible, or there are some limitations to what we can add and not add?
So you gave an example, like perhaps PID. Could you talk about?
Yes, that's I think that's the general example, because PIDs should be there. I'm not sure if they could be added, because I have very limited experience with Dataverse. That's why perhaps I gave that PID example. But uh, the examples that you were showing earlier when you were creating the metadata block, can you add flexibility to that, or is it depending on what you can customize? I'm not sure if I make sense, or is it clear or not?
So when you say PIDs in relation to metadata blocks, I'm thinking of
Yes,
these term URIs, like this row.
by the sorry, could you repeat?
When you say PIDs, I'm thinking that makes me think of this term URI column in the metadata block. Um, can you see that on?
I can't see anything.
Am I not sharing my screen anymore?
No, no, you're not sharing your screen.
Oh, okay. Send request to share my screen. Oh, is it because someone else is sharing their screen?
I don't think anyone is sharing.
Okay. I wanted to show.
Can you share your screen now? I made you the host.
Okay. Does that work?
It's starting. Yes. Okay, great. So perhaps we can ignore the PID. That was a general example, but when you specify here a set of attributes that you want to define, is there any limitation, or I can add any attribute that I want and then it would start to appear in the metadata creation? That's what I mean
Oh,
by flexibility.
oh, so by attribute that could mean here columns, like the field type, display order, display format, advanced search.
By attribute, I mean, for example, the title, the author name, affiliation, and so on. That's what I mean by attribute.
You can add your own fields. You can add your own rows.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, and folks using Dataverse, yeah, do that all the time. So they create their own metadata blocks and add their own rows, dataset fields. Um,
Okay, I
uh,
see. I guess in that case, it's completely flexible. I can add, so by attribute, in this case, it's a row. So I can add any row that I want, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay,
Um,
that's great.
it is super flexible. There are efforts in the community to share how, the metadata blocks that people are creating. And to collaborate on creating uh, new metadata blocks and editing existing, the metadata blocks that ship with Dataverse, like this citation metadata block that I've been using. All right,
Okay,
and
that's
then
great. Thank you.
thank you. We'll end the webinar. I see that I might have shared the wrong link to the um, survey. So as soon as possible, I'll make sure that we have the right link when we post uh, the slides and the recording as well. Apologies for that, and thank you all for your patience with my mic being muted for the start. I hope this was really helpful, and yeah, we'll see you for the next webinars. All right, thanks a lot, everyone. I hope you enjoy your Tuesday.